Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newsam's Night TV studio and another edition of Inside Media. I'm your host, John Maynard. Well, next year, the nation will mark the very somber anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It remains one of America's darkest days and a day that changed the course of American history. In April of 2013, the Newsam will open an exhibit related to the anniversary of the death of JFK, concentrating on the media coverage of that tragic day. Well, today we are honored to have with us Clint Hill, the former United States Secret Service agent assigned to First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. Clint was in the presidential motorcade during the assassination. Clint will, of course, recount his memories of that tragic day in November 1963, but we are also here today to talk to Clint about his memories of Mrs. Kennedy, as detailed so wonderfully in his new memoir, Mrs. Kennedy and Me. Clint was assigned to Mrs. Kennedy and the Kennedy children in 1960, just following John F. Kennedy's election. He remained with her until 1964 before being assigned to President Lyndon Johnson, where he eventually became the special agent in charge of presidential protection. In 1972, Hill was promoted to Assistant Director of the Secret Service before retiring in 1975. We are also joined today by the co-author of the book, Lisa McCubbin, an award-winning journalist who has been a TV news anchor and reporter. Lisa has hosted her own radio show and spent more than 5 years in the Middle East as a freelance writer. She is also the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, The Kennedy Detail. So please welcome Clint Hill and Lisa McCubbin.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, in just a moment, Clint and Lisa are going to walk us through a very moving presentation about Clint's time with Mrs. Kennedy, so I'll get out of the way. But I do want to ask just a couple questions to kick off the program. Clint, to start, why did you wait until now to write this book about your time with Jacqueline Kennedy?
Well, I'd vowed I never would write a book, promised myself and others that I would not do it. I was offered every opportunity to do so or to contribute to a book, and I always said no. Then a friend of mine who had been an agent decided to write a book, and he enlisted the aid of Lisa McCubbin. And in that process, they came to me for some guidance and some information that I had that no one else had. And I got to know Lisa McCubbin very well. I trusted her, I had confidence in her. And over a period of time, she convinced me that the information I had was historical and should be documented. And so she wore me down, and I gradually accepted the idea that I should write a book, and we wrote it together.
Right, right. Well, there's been so much written about Mrs. Kennedy, and what do you hope people might get out of this book that they might not know about Jacqueline Kennedy?
Well, I think they're going to have a better understanding of actually who she was, especially during that 4-year period when I was with her. I was with her during the time she was in the White House, plus 1 year after that. They're going to find out how intelligent she was, how athletic she was, and what a dedicated and devoted mother and wife that she was. And things like that really haven't been revealed much. Some of the books are written by friends of friends of friends, and they really don't tell who she really was.
And Lisa, before we begin with the presentation, this is the Newsam. You are a journalist. Tell us about the process of putting this book together. How did you two work together? How well did you work together?
We worked great together. Clint had told me a lot of stories while we were working on the other book, and when he finally agreed to do this book, he said, well, I don't think I have enough material. And I said, Clint, I have enough material to write the book without you, just from what you told me, but I think we should do it together. And so Simon & Schuster actually came to us and asked us to write the book, and we worked for about 9 months solid, 2 computers side by side, and it was a real collaboration. We had to do a lot of research and talk to a lot of other agents who were there at the time, because Clint wanted to make sure everything was factual. There was going to be no salacious details, no gossip in the book, just a nice tribute to the woman he respected and admired.
Well, with that, I will now cede the floor to Clint and Lisa for their presentation. I'll be back when they're finished, and then I'll facilitate questions from the audience, because we do want to hear from you. So if you two want to start your presentation, that'd be great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Nice to get out of the heat anyway. So we're going to start today with Clint. You were born in January 1932 in North Dakota, and you were left on the doorstep of an orphanage. Fortunately, not too long after that, you were adopted by two wonderful parents, and you grew up in Washburn, North Dakota, population 912. And I know you had a wonderful childhood, but from such humble beginnings, how did you then end up being a Secret Service agent?
Well, when I finished college, I was obligated to enter the military because I'd been deferred for my college education. And when I took a battery of tests, the Army decided to send me to the Army Intelligence Center for training, and I became a special agent in counterintelligence. And during that process, I worked with some Secret Service agents and got to know them. I liked the investigative work, and so I was really thinking about continuing that after I got out of the Army. I wanted to go into the Secret Service if possible, but there were only 269 total agents in the organization at that time. And the only way you got in was somebody had to die or retire. And in my case, somebody retired, and I was accepted as an agent.
And shortly after joining the Secret Service, you were called to the White House. You were assigned to President Eisenhower. This is a photograph. You can see Clint standing in the doorway there with President Eisenhower. Tell us what it was like protecting President Eisenhower, and what kind of equipment did you have back in 1960?
Well, President Eisenhower had been a general, so he treated us just like his troops. And we respected him very, very much, because most of us had been in the military. He was very congenial gentleman, very prompt. When we gave him a schedule, it said we want to depart at 9:30 a.m. At 9:29.30, he was in the car ready to go. That was very different than a lot of people. And but when he wanted to talk to us or wanted to do something, he didn't know us by name or call us by name. He just said, "Hey, agent," and that would how he would get our attention. Back in those days, we didn't have computers. We didn't have personal communications equipment. We had 3x5 cards with a photograph of an individual we were interested in on one side and identifying data on the other that told us who he was and why we were interested in him. And that was our really only type of computer information that we had, if you want to call it that. And we carried those with us whenever we traveled with Protectee.
And in a situation like this, on a motorcade, you'd use hand signals with the other agents if you saw somebody.
That's correct. We only used hand signals because we didn't have personal communication devices.
And then in 1960, John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon by a slim margin, and you expected that you would be assigned to John F. Kennedy, but you found out instead that you were going to be assigned to the First Lady. And how did you feel about that?
Like somebody kicked me in the gut, because I didn't want that assignment. I wanted to be with the president because I knew what happened to agents that had been assigned to First Ladies like Bess Truman or Mamie Eisenhower. They went to afternoon tea parties, fashion shows, ballet school, and I wanted to be where the action was, and that was with the president, because I'd been with Eisenhower and we'd been all over the world, Europe, Asia, South America. And I didn't think that was going to happen being with the First Lady.
But then you ended up meeting her a few days after the election. She was about 8.5 months pregnant. And what was that first meeting like?
Well, I didn't want to go meet her. She didn't want me there because she didn't want anybody looking over her shoulder 24 hours a day either. But we understood that we had to get along somehow, and we gradually got along very, very well. She trusted me, and we had a wonderful relationship.
And just a few weeks later, on Thanksgiving evening, President Kennedy had been with the family on Thanksgiving, and then he flew down to Palm Beach where he was organizing his cabinet, and Mrs. Kennedy went into early labor, and you got a phone call, and tell us what that was like.
Yeah, the president had flown to Florida, and about 10 o'clock or so I got a phone call saying they'd called an ambulance and they'd taken Mrs. Kennedy to Georgetown Hospital. She was going into labor. So I raced to the hospital. The president was on his way to Florida, hadn't arrived yet. When he got there, they notified him, and he got on a press plane, which was faster than the Caroline, that his personal plane that flew him to Florida. He rode the press plane back. And I was at Georgetown Hospital, pacing the floor like an expectant father, and waiting for him to get there. And then young John Jr. was born.
And this is a photograph when Mrs. Kennedy was released a couple of weeks later from the hospital. That's Clint peering from behind there in the trench coat, and John Jr. And that particular day, you went to the White House for her first tour of the White House with Mamie Eisenhower.
That's correct. She had to go to the White House that day to receive a tour of the White House by Mrs. Eisenhower. She was very weak, but she went through it okay. And then we got on an aircraft and flew down to Palm Beach to spend some time in Florida.
So this is where President and Mrs. Kennedy were going to spend the time before the inauguration, down at President Kennedy's father's house in Palm Beach. And Clint, explain to us what we're seeing in this photo.
It's the Joseph P. Kennedy residence in Palm Beach. It was going to be the winter White House for President Kennedy. It's right on the Atlantic Ocean. Here's the ocean. There's a seawall there, a large expanse of grass and lawn. That's a swimming pool with pumped-in salt water, tennis courts, a large residence with many, many bedrooms, and that's a garage where this car is located. That's where our offices were, in the garage.
And so you secured this area. So as the agents, did you stay at the house there with the president?
No. This is where we stayed. This is in West Palm Beach. It's Woody's Motel, and we stayed there. We were given $12 a day. That was to cover our room, board, laundry, and dry cleaning. And that's why we stayed in Woody's, because we could afford it. But it was okay. They had a swimming pool.
And they had air conditioning. So you spent the first Christmas and New Year's of 1960 down there, and then in 1961, the family got back together at the White House, and this is a photograph of them the first day they entered the White House all together as a family in February of 1961.
That's correct. They came back. We brought the children back from Florida, and the family went into the White House together as a family.
Now, Mrs. Kennedy, however, was a very private person, and she wasn't all that excited about being in the public eye, so she found a place which was sort of a weekend retreat where she thought the family could go on weekends. Out in Middleburg, Virginia. Tell us about this, and you spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, she came to me and said that she wanted a place where the president and the children could get away from the stress and strains of the White House. And so they leased a place in Middleburg, 400-acre estate called Glenora. She wanted to go there so she could ride, because she loved to ride horses. And it gave her an opportunity to just have some family life, very private. This is the estate. This is the house back in the woods here. This is a recreation area with a pool. This large expanse of grass is where we landed the helicopter for the president to come in, usually on a Saturday morning, and he would leave again on Sunday afternoon. And this is the stables where they kept the horses. Our offices were on the second floor of the stables.
So you knew the pecking order.
Yes,
you were above the horses.
We were above.
And one of the things that people might not know about Mrs. Kennedy is she was a really wonderful athlete. She loved sports. She loved being in the outdoors.
She loved to ride horses, and she was very accomplished at it. And every chance she had, we would be out in Middleburg, and she'd be riding the horses and jumping. She also was a very, very talented water skier. She played tennis, and she played golf. She was active all the time, never a dull moment. She was very energetic, very active.
And along with being out at Middleburg a lot, at Glenora, you also spent a lot of time in Hyannisport. Tell us, what was it like hanging out with the Kennedys in Hyannisport?
Well, this is a photograph of Ambassador Joseph Kennedy's home in Hyannisport, in part of what's called the Kennedy compound, where there were houses that Eunice Kennedy Shriver had a house there with her husband Sarge. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had a house there, he and his wife and children. And the President, Mrs. Kennedy, had a home there in this Kennedy compound. Young Teddy lived on Squaw Island. But there was a wonderful grassy area there where they would participate together in various activities. They loved to play touch football, and I had the opportunity occasionally to be called in to play with them, which gave me the chance to get even for some of the things that they had done. And it was very, very good experience for me. They loved to go there because it was one large family, and it was just activity all the time.
And you had sort of a routine. In the summertime, you would be there most of the summer with Mrs. Kennedy and the children, and then the president would come on the weekends. What was that like?
Well, he would come in usually on Friday afternoon, He would arrive on Air Force One at Otis Air Force Base near Hyannis, and then he would fly over in a helicopter. He would land right out in front of the ambassador's residence on a grassy area. We would pre-position a golf cart there. He'd get off the helicopter, walk over to the golf cart, get on, holler out, anybody for ice cream. All his nephews, nieces, his children would jump on the golf cart, and off he'd go to the local ice cream store, which was 2.5 blocks away, and then he'd foot the bill.
And as most people know, the president loved sailing, loved to be on the water. He spent a lot of time on the water as well. And this is a photograph of the two of them on one of the many yachts that you had the occasion to be on. You got very close to the family because at the time there were only 2 agents assigned to Mrs. Kennedy full-time and 3 agents assigned to the children. So you really became close. And we're going to show a video now that kind of exemplifies that relationship.
Yes, we had a wonderful relationship, and they loved the water, as you've said. They had many choices to choose from in boats. This is the family on one of their motor launches. That's myself and young John. We're just leaving the Honeyfits, where he'd been with his mom and dad. He now wanted to go ashore. So while we're on the way, I thought I'd show him how the boat functioned here. In a moment, you'll see that I gave him a bird's eye view of everything. And we progressed to the shore so young John could go ashore. And you'll see I turn him over to another agent. Agent Foster wasn't quite properly attired for the occasion, but he made do with the best he could. Of course, we had to have the animals there. They had plenty of dogs. But young John was not too interested in staying ashore. He wanted to go back and see Mommy and Dad. So back on the boat, and we'd take him back to the Honeyfits in this example. Of course, I had to have my usual cigarette because I had a terrible habit. But back to the boat we go, and I hand him off to another agent to take him up to be with his mom and dad. And that's the way it went day after day up in Hyannisford, Massachusetts.
Back and forth, the kids and the dogs and the
family. It was a wonderful time. We had a good time doing it.
Now, shortly after the President and Mrs. Kennedy took office, they started traveling almost immediately overseas, and one of the first trips was to Paris and Vienna, a highly publicized trip. This is a photograph of Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. de Gaulle. That's Clint peering behind the two of them. You'll get to see where Clint is in these photographs. Try to pick him out as we go through this. How did the people overseas react to the President and Mrs. Kennedy?
Well, on this occasion, we went to France. I was sent there ahead as the advance agent with Mrs. Kennedy's social secretary, Tish Baldridge, and we made the arrangements for her visit. The French were very enthusiastic about this trip, especially so for Mrs. Kennedy because she had studied in France, she'd lived there with a family for a while, she spoke fluent French, and so she got along very well. One of the people she got along very well with was President de Gaulle, who was very kind of restrained. He didn't have too much to say to many people, but Mrs. Kennedy got his ear. She talked to him. At one point he turned to her and said, "Oh, Mrs. Kennedy, I wish the people of France knew as much French history as you did." And then she convinced him over a few days there that we were there that the French should allow the Mona Lisa to come to the United States. So she, working with President de Gaulle and her Minister of Culture, Andre Malraux, arranged for the Mona Lisa to be brought to the United States to be exhibited here.
And then after this trip to Paris and Vienna, Mrs. Kennedy was going to go on her first trip alone abroad, since she had been First Lady, to Greece. And something happened prior to this whole Paris-Vienna-Greece trip. Tell us about that.
Yes, I was going to go directly from Paris. Mrs. Kennedy and the President were going to go to Vienna. And I was going to go, instead of Vienna, I was going to Athens to set up her trip to Athens. So before I left for Paris, I was called into the Oval Office. The President said he wanted to talk to me, so I went into the Oval Office, and he was there with his brother, the Attorney General. And he said, "Clint," he said, "I understand you're going to do the advance for Mrs. Kennedy in Greece." And I said, "Yes, Mr. President." He said, "One thing I want to make sure of, and that is that while Mrs. Kennedy is in Greece, while she's there, she never crosses paths with Aristotle Onassis." I said, "All right, Mr. President, I'll make sure of that." And I went back to my office. I didn't know why. So I did a little research, and I found that Onassis had been in legal trouble with the United States government. He had been fined a significant amount of money, and they did not want a photograph to appear with Mrs. Kennedy and Onassis in that shot. And so on that trip in 1961 to Greece, she did not cross paths with Aristotle Onassis.
And this is a photograph from that trip. That's Clint in the sunglasses. And I just want you to notice the crowds that were always around that followed Mrs. Kennedy. And that was part of your problem, or challenge, I should say.
And wherever we
in
went, the
protecting her.
crowds were enormous. She was a very, very popular, not only internationally, but here in the United States as well.
And then in 1962, Mrs. Kennedy decided to take an historic trip to India and Pakistan. And this would be the first time an American First Lady had ever traveled to either of these two countries. Once again, Clint went ahead on the advance to handle the very delicate arrangements, and she was very well received. But tell us a little bit about going to India and what that entailed.
Well, what it entailed was working with Ambassador Ken Galbraith, who wanted her to stay there for 30 days. And we didn't want her there for more than 10 or so. And so I worked with Ambassador Galbraith, and we got it cut down to almost 10 days. But she loved it there in India, and this is a shot of, she's out at the parade grounds for the President of India's Guard, and they had a large contingent of horses, and she was permitted to ride there. We made these arrangements for her, and she was very happy about that, as you can see. We went from India on over to Pakistan. And the first stop was Lahore, Pakistan.
And we're going to show you a video. This one has some audio, so we'll let the audio play a little bit, and then just tell us what's going on as we see it go. We'll get it. I might need Nate's help. Let me try this.
Of a modern ritual, celebrating a young tradition in the ancient city of Lahore. The 9th annual Pakistani National Horse and Cattle Show.
Yes, Mrs. Kennedy rode into the International Horse Show in the chariot with President Ayub Khan, and they were given a performance by a variety of people and organizations. Then President Ayub Khan wanted to present something to Mrs. Kennedy. That was a horse. His name was Sardar. And so he made a presentation, and you'll notice how happy she is with this presentation.
She loves that horse. You can see
She
it.
loved the horse. And
And what were you thinking as she
well,
was
I
being
had a
presented
problem.
this horse?
My thought was, how am I get this damn horse back to Washington? Because we had just been given 2 tiger cubs in India. And so we had a problem, but the problem was solved through the use of the military and the State Department.
And then you also went up to the Khyber Pass while you were in Pakistan, and there was another event with another animal.
Yes, we went from Lahore, we went over to West Pakistan, up to the northwest corner of Pakistan, up to the Khyber Pass. In order to get there, we had to pass through the tribal areas, and the tribal chieftains said, okay, you can come through our area, but we want to honor Mrs. Kennedy while she's going through here. So they wanted us to stop, and they were going to have a little ceremony. And the advance agent came to me and said, you know, Clint, he said, they're going to make a presentation to her. They're going to give her a dagger. We never could understand why. And a lamb. I said, wait a minute. I said, we've got a horse and 2 tiger cubs. I don't need a damn lamb. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, they're not going to give her the lamb. They're going to sacrifice the lamb in her honor. I said, not in her presence, they're not. I said, go back to the tribal chieftains and tell them, when they get to the point where they want to sacrifice the lamb, I'm putting her in the car, and we're leaving for the Khyber Pass. They can take the lamb out behind the tent and do whatever they want to it, but we're going to be gone when that happens. And so that's exactly what happened.
And then on your last day in Pakistan, yet another animal incident. Tell us first about Bashir, the camel driver, and then we'll play the video.
Well, Bashir was a camel driver in Pakistan, and a year before this, Vice President Johnson had been in Karachi. And as he traveled down the street, he noticed this guy driving his camel down the street, and he had the motorcade stop. He got out, went over and exchanged greetings with the camel driver. and he invited Bashir to come to the United States, never thinking he'd accept. Well, he accepted. And so Bashir became a VIP in Pakistan. And so when Mrs. Kennedy went there, it was mandatory that she stop and see Bashir. So we arranged for Bashir to bring his camel and his family down to a place in Karachi where Mrs. Kennedy could see them. But Bashir had certain instructions from the government of Pakistan and from myself, and they were that, you know, Mrs. Kennedy would pet the camel, they'd probably sit on him, but don't let the camel get up, don't let him move. Of
And
course,
you see all the media there.
all the press
American
are all
media.
over the place. She had other ideas. She wants him up. She wants that camel to get up. And so Bashir is really afraid of what might happen, but the camel got up. Well, she's still not satisfied. She wants the reins to control the camel. And so she takes the reins, and she's sitting up there on this camel. Bashir's holding on for dear life down below for fear something might happen. And then she hits the camel in the rump because she wants the camel to go. Well, fortunately, Bashir and his assistant held on strongly enough to restrain the camel. They just walked around a little while, came back. They got the camel back down to the ground. She and her sister Lee got off. They were very happy, and Bashir was very relieved that nothing had happened.
And you kept your job.
I kept my job.
But I think this was one of the things, the great relationship that Clint and Mrs. Kennedy had, was he allowed her to do these sort of spontaneous things. He knew her personality, and if she wanted to ride the camel, he said, great, go ride the camel. We'll make sure you're safe. And I know she really appreciated that. And then when you were leaving Pakistan, thousands of people came to say goodbye to Mrs. Kennedy. And just imagine the state of Pakistan today and our relationship with Pakistan. So this is 50 years ago, an American First Lady and the crowds coming out to see them.
Very unusual, especially for a female, and the people of Pakistan just loved her. And she was, as the ambassador said, they're the best diplomat they'd ever had from the United States in Pakistan.
So this was in the spring of 1962, and then in the summer of 1962, Mrs. Kennedy went on another foreign trip alone without the president to Italy. It was more of a vacation than an official trip, but once again, Clint, you got to go with her.
Yes, we went to Ravello in Italy. She brought Caroline with her, and this is a photograph of, we're going to Mass. I'm in the front here, and Mrs. Kennedy's right behind me. But you can see all the people over there. That was typical of wherever we went. There were hordes and hordes of people. It was very difficult to control them. We had, in this case, the assistance of the Italian police. This gentleman she is walking with is Johnny Agnelli, the owner of Fiat. He had a big yacht called the Agnetta, and we were going out to get aboard to sail in the area of Amalfi.
Now, in writing this book, I got the privilege to go through thousands of photographs from Clint's personal collection, as well as many photographs you can find. And this is my all-time favorite photograph that we have in the book. And that's Clint in the bow of the boat. Tell us what's going on here, Clint.
Well, Mrs. Kennedy wanted to go to a place called Pestum, where there were some temple ruins. And so we went on the yacht Agnetta, and then we had to use a dinghy to go ashore. And we got ashore, toured the temple ruins, came back to get on the dinghy and go back to the yacht. Well, there was Mrs. Kennedy, her sister Lee, and another female, and then the oarsman and myself. And there were press all over the place. And the dinghy was about to sink. And I'm screaming at the press to help us, get us moving, help us get out of here. She's sitting there laughing at me. She knew it was about time to go under, and she was hoping, I think, that we were going to sink. But we fortunately made it back to the yacht in one piece.
And during the course of your time with Mrs. Kennedy, you had become so close, especially by 1963, with the family. And you were often asked to do things that were a little bit outside of the normal job description of a Secret Service agent.
They were quite a ways outside the job description. We went to, President and Mrs. Kennedy flew down to Florida on a Friday, and they were having dinner that evening with some friends at a house. And so I left my assistant, Paul Landis, with her, and I went to my hotel room to get some rest. I was sitting on my bed there in my shorts and my T-shirt. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Kennedy. She said, "Oh, Mr. Hill," she said, "the president and I would like to have you do something for us." I said, "All right, ma'am, what's that?" She said, "You know, Prince Radziwill is here," and that was the president's brother-in-law, "and Chuck Spaulding's here also," and that was one of the president's best friends. "And they're going to go on a 50-mile hike. And we know that the Secret Service is going to want to have somebody out there with them because the President and I are going to come out and check on them periodically to make sure everything's okay. And the President and I think that should be you. I said, all right, Mrs. Kennedy, I'll see what I can do. I said, when do they want to start? She said, oh, at midnight. I said, okay. And I said, I'll be right there. So I hung up and sat there and said to myself, what can I wear to go on a 50-mile hike? I'm certainly not prepared for that. I had shoes was a problem. I had a pair of Florsheim wingtip dress shoes, and that's what I had to wear because that was the only thing that was sturdy enough to make this 50-mile jaunt. And so I picked them up out to the Sunshine Parkway that had just been opened, and we started walking south toward Fort Lauderdale.
And periodically, the president would come out to visit, and this is one of those shots.
Yes, he came out, and because they decided to take a rest, the president was giving me a bad time for them not being up and walking, because there was a little wager involved here between the president and these two gentlemen, and he wanted to make sure that we were going to stress and strain him as much as possible, because he didn't want him to make it if possible.
And so you finished the 50-mile hike in about 20 hours.
We got down to the end place, and it was about 8 o'clock at night, and I was so relieved. I was waiting to get back to my room to get a shower, get into bed, but we got back to the house, and the president said he wanted to see me. So I went into the house, and there we had a little party going on, and so President and Mrs. Kennedy had created a medal made out of crepe paper, construction paper. And they had made a little chain ribbon to go around my neck made out of crepe paper. And so they had a presentation ceremony in the house, and he presented me with this medal. It says, "For Dazzle." That was my code name. February 23, 1963. The Order of the Pacemaker. He whom the Secret Service will follow into the battle of the Sunshine Highway, John F. Kennedy.
And you still have that.
I still have that, yes. It's one of my cherished possessions.
And then around this same time in early 1963, Mrs. Kennedy informed you that there were going to be some changes coming up.
Yes, she came to me and said, you know, Mr. Hill, she said, I'm going to have to curtail a great deal of my activity. And I said, oh, I said, is there something wrong? And she said, no. She said, I'm pregnant. I said, oh, wonderful. She said, you know, you're not going to be going to Greece or Italy this summer. And she kind of laughed. She said, we're going to spend the summer in Hyannisport. And she said, Dr. Walsh, my doctor's also going to be there. And so that's what we did. We went to Hyannisport that early summer, and we were there. On August 7th, I was on a day off there in Hyannisport. My associate Paul Landis was with her, and he had taken her out to the stables to watch Caroline ride. And when they got there, she turned to him and said, Paul, I think you better take me back to the residence. She said, I don't feel well. And so he put her in the car, and they started back, and she kept saying, can you go a little faster? He kept saying to himself, don't have that baby in the backseat of the car. And they radioed ahead and asked that the doctor meet them at the residence, and they asked him to notify me what was going on. When they got to the residence, the doctor said, Mrs. Kennedy, you have to go to the hospital right now. So they called in a helicopter, and they notified me, and they were going to fly to Otis Air Force Base, where we had established a temporary medical facility in case of such a situation. When they got to Otis, I met them there, and she went into labor. The president was at the White House. We notified him, and I paced the floor again outside the room like another expectant father again, waiting for the president to arrive. When the baby was born, he had a lot of difficulty. He had some lung problems.
He was about 6 weeks premature.
He was premature. And so the doctors wanted to talk to the president as soon as he arrived. I informed the president they wanted to see him. Shortly thereafter, the president came and said, you better get us a priest. We want to baptize the little boy. So they baptized him, and they named him Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. Then the doctors decided they were going to have to take him to Boston for additional medical assistance because they didn't have the right equipment there at Otis Air Force Base. But they couldn't fly him by chopper. They had to go by ambulance. So I put Agent Landis with young Patrick, and they took off for Boston, drove to Boston. The president flew on to Boston to be with him. That was on August 7th. August 8th, he didn't improve. Early in the morning of August 9th, I got a phone call, and young Patrick had died. We were told that the doctors would be the ones to notify Mrs. Kennedy, Dr. Walsh specifically, who would come and tell her as soon as she woke up. And that's what happened. Then the president flew out to see her, to be with her, to console her. And then he flew back to Boston to arrange for the funeral. Mrs. Kennedy was unable to go because of her condition. She and I stayed there at Otis Air Force Base. She was very depressed. Her sister flew in from London. Lee is her name. And she and Mrs. Kennedy talked, and Lee convinced her that she should go away for a while. And Lee and her husband, Prince Radziwill, had a friend who owned a big yacht. And the yacht was available if she wanted to use it. And so it was decided that she would go. The president's staff were against it, but the president said he wanted her to go. And so we flew to Athens, Greece, and got on board the Christina, which is a 325-foot yacht owned by Aristotle Onassis. And Onassis was on board.
And you were on board?
I was on board with Agent Landis. This is a photograph of Onassis. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., his wife Sue, Mrs. Kennedy. And we toured the area there of the Greek islands and up into Turkey and came back out. And she had a wonderful time. Her spirits were rejuvenated. And when we came back out, she let me know that she was going to participate with the president in trying to make sure that they were reelected in 1964. She was going to contribute by going with him to the state of Texas when he visited there that November.
And the president and Mrs. Kennedy had become so popular, not only in America, but also around the world. And Clint, we're going to go through a few slides as we lead into what happened in Dallas in 1963. Explain to us what we're seeing in these slides around the world.
This is the president's visit to Ireland. You can see the crowds there. You see the people hanging out windows, open windows all the way around. That was typical. Massive crowds no matter where we went. This is in Costa Rica. The military had a hard time controlling the people. It was very difficult for them. This is the president back here. This is in Mexico City. That's not snow. That's confetti. It was so thick that the car was filled right up to the top of the seats by the time we got to the end of the motorcade. Then this is Billings, Montana, which was typical in the United States. Somebody has taken their child and passed him across the top of the crowd so that the president can touch the child or the child can touch the president. That was very typical. This is in Berlin, Germany. This is the president with Willy Brandt and Konrad Adenauer. But you notice these two females had broken through the security line and gone toward the car. The agents are trying to repel them.
And this was typical.
This is what happened all the time. And then this is at the speech site in Berlin, where the president declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." And you'll notice people on rooftops hanging out of windows, windows open all over the place. There were more than 1 million people there at this speech site. But I just wanted you to get the idea that this is typical of the situation that existed during that period of time.
And President Kennedy realized that in order to get reelected, although he was popular, there was still, he had been elected by a very slim margin, and he knew that he was going to have to get 2 key states in 1964 in order to be reelected, and those states were Florida and Texas.
That's correct. He needed those electoral votes. And so first, President Kennedy wanted to go into Florida, and he went into Palm Beach, Cape Canaveral, Tampa, and Miami. When he got to Tampa, they had a 26-mile motorcade there. And the agent that was doing the advance realized that the agents couldn't work the car for 26 total miles, so he put them up on the back of the car like this. Well, during the process of motorcade, the crowds dropped off. The president turned around and noticed the agents there, tapped the agent in the right front seat, who happens to be sitting there, said, "Will you please get those Ivy League charlatans off the back of the car, please?" Well, we didn't know what he meant for sure about Ivy League charlatans, but we sure as hell knew what he meant by get off the back of the car. And so that's what they did eventually. And at the finish of the motorcade, the president came to the advance man and the senior agent and said, "Look, we're going into a campaign year. I do not want it to appear that there's anything between the people and myself. I want them to feel that I'm accessible. Therefore, I don't want the agents on the back of the car unless it's an absolute necessity. And it wasn't in Tampa, he said. And so from now on, try and stay off the back of the car. The word went out all over. It wasn't in writing, but we were all given the word that that's what he wanted.
And this was November 18th, 1963. And then Mrs. Kennedy had told you after coming back from this wonderful trip on the yacht Christina, she was feeling a lot better. She wanted to campaign, and she told you that she was going to go on the trip to Texas, which would be her first ever domestic political trip with the president. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so the trip was scheduled to leave Washington on Thursday, November 21st, fly down to San Antonio, do a dedication of a hospital there, fly over to Houston, do a fundraiser, and speak to a LULAC group, a Hispanic-speaking group, fly to Fort Worth, stay overnight, and the first thing the next morning, he was to speak outside the hotel there in Fort Worth. And it was raining lightly at 8:30 when he went out to make this speech. When he went out to make the speech, I went to the suite where Mrs. Kennedy was to stand by, because we thought we were just going to go from the suite right to the airport. While I was there, the president had come back into the hotel to attend a breakfast. Phone rang. The agent with him downstairs said, "Clint, the president wants you to bring Mrs. Kennedy down here right now." Well, she hadn't expected to go, and I hadn't anticipated her going. So I told her, we're going down to breakfast. And so we did. We walked into the room, 2,500 people there. Everybody, when they saw her, it was standing ovation. Everybody applauding. She was very well received. She got to the head table. The president said, "As I travel around Texas, I'm getting the same feeling I had when I was in Paris, that I'm the man who's accompanying Mrs. Kennedy to Texas." He said, "You know, nobody cares what Lyndon and I wear." He said, "But they certainly care what she wears." She was rather embarrassed, but she took it in good.
And that was typical of his sense of humor.
Very much so. And so we then flew from Fort Worth on over to Love Field in Dallas.
And we're going to show you a video and just walk us through so you can get a sense of what it was like as they landed in Dallas, which Fort Worth to Dallas was really not that far of a distance.
No, we could have driven to where our destination was, the Trade Mart, or be much faster by car instead of flying over. Here you see them coming off the aircraft to be greeted by officials there in Dallas, the mayor and his wife, Mayor Cabell, and she was presented with some red roses. The president saw that there was a crowd along the fence line, so he immediately turned and started to go to that crowd. Normally she wouldn't have done that, but since she was going to contribute to this campaign, she just went right along and did the same thing. She was shaking hands as we walked down the fence line, waiting to get into a car to depart Love Field. The press were having a field day, enjoying the relationship that they were receiving from the crowd there. It was very exuberant, very happy. The crowd was very glad to see them, even though in Dallas there had been some ads in papers and things of that nature that were anti-Kennedy. And yet, as we traveled into downtown Dallas, the crowds became larger and larger. By the time we got down to Main Street, the crowds were so large they were spilling into the street. The driver of the presidential vehicle was trying to keep the president, who was in the right rear, away from the crowd on the right rear side. He put us up against the left side of the car, up against the crowd. That put Mrs. Kennedy right up next to the crowd. So I would jump off the follow-up car, I was in the car right behind the president, and get up on the back of the presidential vehicle. I knew what the standing rule was because of what he had said in Tampa. But I also knew my responsibility, and I wanted to be in very close proximity so to make sure nothing happened. And so as we moved on down the street there in Dallas, you can see people on balconies, windows are open. Now you have to understand, in 1963, central air conditioning wasn't a matter of fact in most of these big buildings. So they did have windows open all the time. And so here I am on the back of the car as we're coming in down Main Street in Dallas. When we got down to the end of Main Street, we were going to have to go into an area called Dealey Plaza. We were going to have to turn right on Houston and then left on Elm. People always say, "Why didn't you go straight down Main Street?" The reason is we want to turn right to go on the Stemmons Freeway to get to where our destination, the Trade Mart. And there was a barricade at the end of Main Street preventing us from making that right turn. We couldn't do it. And so we had to turn right on Houston, left on Elm, then we could get to the right to go to the Trade Mart. But that turn onto Elm Street was extremely sharp. And that meant the car had to slow way down as we made that turn. This is a shot showing that I'm scanning to my left, and the other agents are scanning to their right. This is myself here. I was watching the people in the grassy area. I heard an explosive noise over my right rear shoulder, or the right rear of the motorcade. When I heard it, my vision then went from scanning that grassy area toward the noise, which meant I had to pass over the back of the car with my eyes. And I saw what happened in the car. I saw the president grab at his throat. I saw him lurch to his left. I knew he was in trouble. So I jumped and I ran. While I ran, there was another shot. I didn't hear it. The guys told me that that happened. Then, just before I got to the car, there was a third shot. It hit the president in the head, right up here, upper right rear. It opened up a massive enough wound so that blood, brain material, bone fragments came out of the wound over myself, over the back of the car. As I was getting up in the car, Mrs. Kennedy came up in the trunk. She was trying to retrieve some of the material that came off the president's head. It had gone off to the right rear of the president's car. I grabbed a hold of her, put her back in the seat. When I did that, the president's body fell to its left into her lap. The right side of his face was up. I could see his eyes were fixed. I could see through the skull into the brain area. Most of that material was gone. I assumed it was a fatal wound. I turned, gave a thumbs down to the follow-up car crew to let them know. We screamed at the lead car, "Get us to a hospital." It was being driven by Chief Curry from Dallas, and he got in front of us and took us to Parkland Hospital. As we traveled, we were going upwards of 80 miles an hour.
And what we're going to show you now is, this is called the Zapruder film, and we're going to show you in real time what happened. This is the only film of the assassination. It's been edited so that the fatal headshot is not being shown. But as you watch this, I just want you to notice how quickly everything happened.
We're going to make a left turn here coming from Houston Street onto Elm Street. There we are coming down Elm. Now, just about here, he is hit for the first time in the middle of the back, just below the neck, came out out the windpipe area, didn't hit any hard surface. It was not a fatal wound. But then the headshot came, and it was a fatal wound. I got up on top of the car. My objective when I ran was to get up there and form a shield behind President and Mrs. Kennedy to protect them from whoever was trying to do them harm. So I wedged myself in behind the two of them, up on top of the back of the car, got up as high as I could. We were going so fast that I turned my head at one point, my sunglasses flew off.
You were going about 80 miles an hour.
About 80 miles an hour. And I was hanging on, wedged in there as best I could. We got to Parkland Hospital, and we had a problem. That was that the way the car was configured, where the president and Mrs. Kennedy sat, immediately in front of them, there were jump seats. And that's where Governor Connally and Mrs. Connally sat. In order to do anything for the president, we had to first move Governor Connally. I at first didn't know that he had been hit, but he lifted up at one point when we were coming into Parkland, and I noticed there was blood all over him. So I knew he'd been hit. So we lifted up the governor, put him on a gurney. Mrs. Connally and the governor were taken into the emergency room, one of the trauma rooms. Then we were going to move President Kennedy. I pleaded with Mrs. Kennedy to let me help the president. She wouldn't let go of the body. I pleaded with her, and finally I recognized the problem was she didn't want anybody to see how bad this situation really was, because it was terrible. So I took off my coat and I covered up his head and his upper back. When I did that, she let go, and we lifted him up, put him on a gurney, and rushed him into the emergency room. When we got into the emergency room, there were doctors all over the place. Some were working on the governor, others were working on the president. They were trying to revive him as best they could. About that time, my boss said, get a phone, call Washington, let the White House know what's going on. So I opened a line through the Dallas White House to the White House in Washington, and I told the operator to keep it open. And I was talking to Mr. Bain, the agent in charge, when the operator cut in and said, Mr. Hill, the Attorney General wants to talk to you. I said, okay. So I said, yes, Mr. Attorney General. He said, Clint, he said, what's going on down there? So I told him what had happened, that the president had been shot, the governor had been shot. We're at Parkland Hospital in the emergency room. And he apparently didn't realize how serious it was. He had been advised by J. Edgar Hoover that there had been a shooting, but had been given no more information than that. And so when he asked me that question, how bad is it, I didn't want to tell him that his brother was dead. So I simply said, it's as bad as it can get. And with that, he hung up the phone. That's how he found out that his brother had been killed. We were in Parkland. About 1 o'clock, the doctors declared him dead. And the two staff members that had been with President Kennedy, Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers, came to me and said, Clint, get us a casket. We have to have somebody to transport the president's body back to Washington. I said, okay. So I got in touch with the administrator of the hospital. He put me in touch with the mortuary, O'Neill Mortuary, and I was able to secure a casket and have it brought to the hospital there at Parkland. When the casket arrived, we assumed we would be just placing the body of the president and leaving. But the authorities in Texas said, no, you can't go. You can't go because in Texas, the state law requires that in the area in which there's been a homicide, an autopsy must be performed before that body can be released. We argued that this is president of all the people of the United States. We should be allowed to take him back to the nation's capital. He said, no, that's not what the law says. So that went back and forth for a while. Then we also had the problem, we wanted the vice president who was in the hospital there, the agents had secured him in a special part of the hospital. We wanted him to get out the Air Force One, get on board and get out of the area because we weren't sure exactly what was going on. Well, Vice President Johnson and his wife said, well, we're not going unless Mrs. Kennedy goes with us. And Mrs. Kennedy said, well, I'm not going with them unless the president's body comes with me. And the Texas people said the president's body can't leave the hospital. So Vice President and Mrs. Johnson went out to Air Force One to wait. And we stayed there at the hospital, and we finally said, well, we're leaving anyway. And
No matter what the law is, we're taking.
we just decided we were going to go. And they said, okay, if that's the case, then you have to have a medical professional go with the body for the entire process. I said, we've got the right guy for the job. Admiral George Berkeley is the president's physician. He's here. He'll stay with the body. So that's what we did. So then Mrs. Kennedy came out. We were going to put her in a car behind the hearse. And she said, no, I want to ride in the back of the hearse with the president. So we put her in the back of the hearse with the president. I climbed in with her. Admiral Berkeley's in there with us, the three of us, and the casket. And we drove to Love Field. Got to Love Field, the agents and I, we unloaded the casket. We're carrying it up the rear ramp of Air Force One to place it in the rear part of the aircraft. The Air Force the staff there of Air Force One had removed all the seats from the rear portion to make room for the casket. Trouble was, when we got to the rear door of the Air Force One, the casket was just a little too wide to go through the door. And so we had to break the handles off the casket in order to get it in the aircraft. So we got it in there. Then another problem arose. That was that Vice President Johnson had been in touch with people in Washington, and they told him that he had to be sworn in there on the ground in Dallas. And so that was the next thing that was going to happen. But just before that happened, Mrs. Kennedy sent word to me. She wanted to see me. I was in the forward part of the aircraft. She was in the rear where the body was. I came back to the presidential compartment. She stood up and grabbed my hands and said, oh, Mr. Hill, what's going to happen to you now? I said, don't worry about me. I'll be okay, Mrs. Kennedy. I'll be okay. She was very concerned about my well-being, even though she was covered in blood and brain matter and knew that she was going to have to stand there beside then Vice President as he was sworn in to be President of the United States. And so that's what happened down in Dallas. There were 3 shots that were fired in Dealey Plaza. For 4 days, the entire world, for all intents and purposes, stopped. And that's what I call the end of the age of innocence.
Clint, I've worked so closely with you these past 2 years, and I think we can all see how difficult it is for you to relive these memories. And there's some precious memories, but obviously some very painful memories. But you are a man of unquestionable courage and integrity. You did what most of us could never even comprehend, and we thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Clint. We just have a few minutes for questions. We'd love to hear from the audience. We have 2 volunteers with mics. Again, we don't have too much time, and we will, again, Clint and Lisa will be outside signing books. But are there any questions we get to? Right up there, we already have one to start, and then we can go in on the 3rd row there.
First of all,
That's fine. That's right. Just yell it out, sir.
I will.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for your service and what you did. I think most of us who were alive at that time would agree with your assessment of the death of the age of innocence. But there's still some unresolved issues. You were on the scene, you worked through it, obviously you lived there. Do you think, it's a fair question, one assassin, what is your take all these years later? How do you feel about it?
There is no indication that there's any more than one assassin. 3 shots, all in the same location, and just one individual firing those 3 shots, Lee Harvey Oswald. There's been a great deal of talk about conspiracies, but if you know anything about conspiracies, they certainly don't last for 50 years, much less, usually they don't last for 45 days. So I don't think there's any question but there was just a lone assassin, and he just had all the advantages that day. We didn't have any.
We have a mic. Is that working? Or?
The light's on, but
Okay.
I'm not getting, oh, yes.
It's working.
Okay. So I think we had a question on the 3rd row there. Is that right, sir? Right there? Thank you. We'll try to get to a few more after this.
Yes, a wonderful presentation. Were there any African American Secret Service agents at the time?
Yes. And unfortunately, he died not too long ago. There were more than one. Charlie Gittins was an agent when I came in 1958. He was in New York. He became a good friend of mine. And there were a number, but Bob Faison was an agent on this particular trip with us in Texas.
We could get, okay, we're gonna do 4 more questions right here, these 4. Right here, sir.
Mr. Hill,
Then we'll-
John had white gloves. Were you the agent? Were you the agent who got them?
No.
And the other, when Mrs. Kennedy passed away prior, why didn't you go visit her?
It was just too painful. I knew that my voice or my presence would just be a reminder of what happened on November 22nd. I didn't want to put her through that.
Thank you.
Top row, sir.
I know as a Secret Service agent, you were trained to handle situations like that, but when the lights are off and the cameras were off, how did you deal with that emotionally?
Well, I kept it inward. That was my problem. I should have sought help, sought counsel, but we were, one thing, we were too busy. We had no one to replace us, and so we just had to keep going, and we did. It was, during that period of time, it was 20-hour days were usual, not the unusual, and we just had to keep going. It would have been very, very beneficial if we'd had counseling and had the time to really talk about it and go through what had happened, but we didn't have that luxury.
Sir in the black and orange shirt, and then we're gonna have one more.
You write about the relationship that you built with Mrs. Kennedy. Do you think those relationships are possible today with the Secret Service in the society that we live in?
They're possible, but I doubt if it would be quite that close, although I understand that in some instances they are very close. So one thing you don't know is that when a president comes into office, they first of all, they are not too happy to have a group of people surrounding him all the time. And when they leave office, they're the only friends they've still got. So that's what really happens.
Sir, right behind the camera there. Yeah. We can get a, yeah, we'll get a mic.
I have nothing but admiration for people who run after cars for a living. What do you have to do to stay in shape to take a 50-mile hike?
Well, Fortunately, I was in good enough shape to do it, but you just keep yourself going, that's all. We were so busy all the time. We didn't have any planned exercise routine, that's for sure. You just were constantly on the move, so everybody was in very good condition.
And you were 31 years old at the time
Yeah,
of the assassination.
Yeah, I'm only 52 now.
I think we're going to have to leave it at that. We have run out of time. Again, Clint and Lisa will be signing copies of the book right outside the studio in our Internet TV and Radio Gallery. Thank you for joining us today for a very special Inside